Welcome everyone to this Adelphi launch by webinar of Emil Hekayem's book Syria's Uprising and the Fracturing of the Levant. My name is Nicholas Redman. I'm the series editor of the Adelphi books. I have here with me the author, my colleague Emil Hekayem. As the peaceful uprising quickly and brutally descended into a zero-sum civil war, Syria crumbled from a regional player into an arena in which a multitude of local and foreign actors compete. The volatile regional fault lines that run through Syria have ruptured during this conflict, and the course of events in this fragile yet strategically significant country will profoundly shape the future of the Levant. Emil's book provides insight into the myriad opposition groups, the conflicting external interests, and the murky calculations of the Assad regime. Tracking the causes of dissent that laid the groundwork for the rebellion, he looks in the book at how Syria's largely apolitical society mobilized and at the unpredictable dynamics that have been unleashed as the protest movement has radicalized and militarized. Emil is a senior fellow for regional security at the Middle East office of the IISS based in the Kingdom of Bahrain. He was previously political editor of The National in the UAE and a Middle East analyst at the Stinson Center in Washington, D.C. In a moment I will hand over to Emil. Simply a couple of matters of housekeeping. We are on the record here, we're being recorded. If you have a question, you've no need to wait till the end. You can tap it out on the chat function that you see on your control pad. You can simply reply to the message that is just going out now. Without further ado, I'll turn over to Emil. I'll ask him to speak for about 20-25 minutes or so, and then I'll open it up for questions. Emil.
Thank you, Nick, and good afternoon to all. This book, like all Adelphi's, is not a piece of advocacy, and I hope my presentation today will offer the same fair and rigorous and sober assessment of the key dynamics that are shaping the future of Syria and of the region. I'm sure many of you want to talk about U.S. policy, current dynamics, some of the broader regional issues that have emerged. I will leave this mostly to the Q&A to focus for the moment largely on Syria and the region. For a long time, the debate over Syria obscured the key dynamics that were changing and shaping Syrian society. The debate in the West and many Arab countries about Syria for the past 20-25 years was over whether to engage or isolate Syria, at what cost and to what purpose. The focus was on regime dynamics and the regional statecraft of the Assad regime. The problem in that approach is that first it obscured some of the key domestic dynamics that I will elaborate on in a second, but also it led us to misunderstand Syria's power. Syria's intrinsic power has always been exaggerated in the sense that Syria has very few of the formal attributes of power that its competitors, its regional competitors, mostly primarily Iraq and Egypt have. They had larger industrial base, in the case of Iraq, larger resources, a greater demography, and a greater cultural impact on the rest of the region. It was statecraft that was key, and in a way that was the genius of Hafez al-Assad. Syria was often victim of its geography. It has a very weak geography, surrounded by either more powerful states or weaker states that exported or hosted the driver of instability inside Syria, namely Lebanon. But Hafez al-Assad, by consolidating power inside Syria, starting in the 70s, basically turned Syria's geography into a source of strength by implicating Syria in every regional issue, in every conflict, making itself relevant, though through a largely a role as a spoiler and a blackmailer, rather than a country really able to project positive power in the sense of economic, soft power, military power, etc., save for the question of Lebanon. In the past, also 10-15 years, I would argue that we made a couple of other mistakes in our assessment of the Assad regime. The first is that Bashar al-Assad's risk profile was always misjudged. He was seen as largely weak but predictable, able to deliver but behaving within some parameters, which is true to some extent, but we also need to remember a few things. Bashar al-Assad started a nuclear program despite a very broad assessment that he lacked the resources, the talent, and the risk profile to engage in such a risky venture. He supported Sunni jihadis to frustrate America in Iraq and in Lebanon and other places. He conducted a campaign of regional assassinations as well. All this made sense from his perspective, and perhaps was, the strategy of diplomacy, of engagement, helped allay the most troublesome aspect of that policy. But I would still argue that his risk profile was always underestimated. Another key issue in the previous decade was the relationship between Iran and Syria. For a long time, we focused on the differences between those two countries to argue that this was a marriage of convenience, that because Syria was seen as secular and Iran as a theocratic state, because Syria maintained relations with the West while Iran was isolated by the West, etc., that somehow there was nothing true to that relationship besides just some strategic interest. I would argue that that was the wrong way of looking at this. They were brothers in arms, or perhaps in a more cheeky way, that Iran and Syria, basically the relationship was a marriage of an arranged marriage in which the two partners ended up falling in love with each other over time. There was a convergence of strategic interests, but there was also a convergence in terms of regional legitimacy, of regional perception. And Assad, I would argue, Bashar al-Assad, because he was a useful, newer figure, embraced that relationship, including Hezbollah, and in the process, became a junior member in this alliance. Another issue here when it comes to Syria is that prior to the uprising, there was a tendency to describe the regime as secular in nature. It was always the wrong way of looking at this. We described it as secular because Bashar al-Assad's wife didn't veil, because of lifestyle issues, because of the freedom of religion that was guaranteed inside Syria. Now we're making, the assessment has shifted 180 degrees. The assessment is that the regime is sectarian by nature, is narrow, Alawite, and defines its goals and identity in very narrow sectarian terms. I would argue this is also the wrong way of looking at this. If I can suggest a new term to add to all this, is it's asabiya, it's kinship, group solidarity. This is a concept that explains much better Saddam Hussein's strategies of control and exclusion while he was in power in Iraq, and similarly explains better what Assad has done before the uprising and since the uprising in terms of developing constituencies beyond the Alawite sect. Another reason why we should not only look at the sectarian prism is because we tend to make false assumptions about what sectarianism actually means practically. For instance, there is a broad tendency to think that the Alawite community has, for some reason, benefited disproportionately from 43 years of Assad rule. In reality, there's very little to corroborate this notion. Yes, the Alawite community has done marginally better because it was offered access to more stable jobs in the security services, and its standing also improved in the sense that no longer have the Alawite have to work for large Sunni landowners, as low-level workers, etc. To the contrary, they developed their own industry in a way. But it was always in the regime's interest to keep the community ostracized, marginalized, to keep it on its toes. Basically, if the regime had lifted the fortunes of the Alawite community altogether, it would have ended up with a middle-class Alawite community that would have been much less likely to mobilize in defense of the regime. The middle class doesn't mobilize. The middle class enjoys its lifestyle. It wants to protect them, but it doesn't know how to fight in Syria or anywhere else. It's usually the lower middle class and the lower classes that provide the kind of manpower because they have so little to lose, because this is how you make a buck. Now, let me quickly jump to current dynamics, having set this scene. First, I would argue that Syria has already overtaken Iraq in terms of, in humanitarian, regional, and strategic terms. It is sometimes difficult for Western audiences to accept and absorb this reality because Iraq was so central to the politics of the previous decade, because of the human, political, financial cost of Iraq was so huge. But from a Middle Eastern perspective, from a Levantine perspective, the impact of Syria on the regional balance of power, on the stability of the various states, in terms of how states and key constituencies define their interests and act upon them, Syria has a much greater impact than Iraq. In a way, in Iraq, the U.S. occupation, which was the catalyst for the violence, was also a constant in that equation. All the Iraqi actors based their behavior around their perception of U.S. policy, troop levels, etc. In the case of Syria, I would argue that there is no constant anymore. The only one that was there was the Assad regime. But the Assad regime, after 2 years, is not the only determinant of how certain actors position themselves. Because we have witnessed the emergence of a variety of local and regional actors that define new goals as the conflict continued. Another point is that all the fault lines that cross the Arab world and have crossed Iraq in the previous decade express themselves in Syria much more powerfully and much more potently. In a way, those fault lines that I will describe in a second were in an immature state during the Iraq war. They were just rising. They hadn't crystallized well. So this is the state-society divide. This is the Sunni-Shia competition. This is the competition between various forms of Islam. This is the competition between political Islam on one hand and minorities and secularists on the other hand. And then the issue of ethnic separatism. In the case of Syria, the question of whether Syria as a state would break up or not came much earlier in the conflict than it was in the case of Iraq. Just because those trends have tragically matured in the Syrian case very quickly. So it brings me back to the point I was making earlier, that Syria is shaping the Levant and the broader Middle East in ways Iraq never did. I argue that Lebanon and Iraq today are fully part of the geography of the Syrian conflict. The regional powers, the key regional powers, have equated the unfolding and the outcome of the struggle with their own regional influence and standing. There is a direct connection between the two when you look at how Turkey, how Saudi Arabia, how Qatar, and how Iran think about those issues. The game has also evolved in a zero-sum game very quickly, domestically inside Syria, and I'll get back to this in a second, and regionally. Unlike the civil war in Lebanon that ended in 1990, there's no victor, no vanquish formula. This is seen by everyone as a fight to death. Perhaps that will change as the cost of the struggle increases and as the various as fatigue settles. But this is really the beginning of a long process of political realignments inside Syria and societal changes. And this is not going to unfold in a matter of a year or two. We're in for the long haul. Now, instead of offering a comprehensive description of the state of play inside Syria, which we can do in the Q&A, I want to outline the key asymmetries that explain why we are where we are today inside Syria. The first asymmetry between the Assad regime and the rebellion, and of course I keep in mind that the rebellion, and we can get to this in a second, is a very divided movement in which you have a variety of calculations and actors and ideologies. But bear with me, I'll just use the rebellion not to make my presentation too complex. So the first asymmetry between the regime and the rebellion is that For Assad, the key is to survive in key places, in the central parts of Syria, that corridor that extends from Damascus to Hamas into the coastal regions. Assad is playing defense, and defense is always an easier game to play than offense. While for the rebels, the key here to be taken seriously as an alternative to Assad rule is to expand their territorial hold and gain new constituencies, win key cities. For the moment, the rebels occupy only one city, Raqqa, which is the smallest and the most irrelevant of them all. So that's a big problem in terms of coming across as a key, an alternative to Assad rule. Of course, the decision to launch an attack on Aleppo a year ago was motivated by exactly this. Seizing the largest city in Syria, the key commercial center, would have shifted that perception. But the rebels never had the political strategy, never had the military resources, and never had the organization to really win Aleppo. I criticized this operation from very early on, and I think the way it played out worked in favor of Assad by alienating many urbanites and driving a number of fence-sitters towards Assad. The second asymmetry is an asymmetry in narrative. Basically, Assad knows that different constituencies support him for different reasons, and therefore he has adopted what I call a segmented strategic messaging. He sends different messages to different constituencies. There are constituencies that support him because they still buy into the idea that he embodies the state. I would argue this is denial, but on the part of this constituency, they mean it. They're attached to that continuity, because then there are other constituencies that are organically linked to the regime, like the Alawite community, the Shia community, for instance. There are other constituencies that listen to Assad because of his message of order, not necessarily because they like him, but because in a situation of civil war, the one who provides order at least allows people to go about the business of survival. Whereas if you don't have order, you can't even survive. You're worried about your immediate security. You can't even think about whether and how to get food and get basic services. Where for the rebel, the challenge is that they always lack a unifying aspirational message. So Assad has a segmented message, while the rebels have failed to come up with a unified message, a key asymmetry. An asymmetry that links directly to the previous one is one in mobilization, and this is a key issue. All Assad had to do was to mobilize his core, which he succeeded in doing. And once he mobilized his core, he had he could live with many Syrians living in a state of dejection, neutrality, denial, or survival. As long as they don't join the other side, Assad is fine with a huge segment of Syrian society not supporting him actively. They need to be on the side of this conflict. Whereas for the rebels, as I said earlier, the key is to expand their constituency. Otherwise, they cannot take those key areas. They cannot exist where they need to exist to be taken seriously. And again, as I argued earlier, the entry into Aleppo in July 2012 has really complicated this message. In fact, I would argue that the revolutionary reached its peak in terms of appeal a year ago when the rebels entered Aleppo. Another asymmetry that links into that one is that to survive, Assad needed to turn into a militia, needed to turn his government into a militia. If you're very cynical, you can argue that it was always a militia, even prior to the uprising, and with a veneer of a state, essentially, and that it was very easy for Assad to, embrace his true nature as a, warlord, the head of a mafia-like organization. Whereas for the rebel, and why is it important for him to turn into a militia? Because the way you allocate resources when you head a militia is very different from the way you allocate resources when you're head of a state, when you have to think about broader constituencies, which leads me again to the previous point I made about Assad not caring about many Syrians as long as they remain on the sidelines. Whereas for the rebel, the key is to avoid turning into militias, because otherwise they had no chance of getting no serious chance of getting foreign support, foreign legitimacy, recognition, etc. So to survive and to win, Assad turns into a militia, whereas the rebels have to avoid that in order to strike important gains. Another asymmetry is an asymmetry in terms of military adaptation. In the early days of the uprising, Assad had, I think, did on purpose, escalated the repression to turn the uprising into a militarized one, because this was a level at which he was more comfortable. And he understood that the radicalization of the uprising through its militarization would come at a cost in terms of political appeal, in terms of what many Syrians would be willing to sacrifice to get there. And he has adapted his conventional forces. It was very difficult, I would argue, the first year, but it has happened, in the past 6 to 9 months, to the nature of this fight. And he did a pretty good job at it. There is an irony. The first year and a half of the uprising, everyone celebrated the desertions and defections that affected the Syrian military. Ironically, this has created a more reliable, therefore more deployable core for Assad. And what happened is that Assad started relying on locally recruited militias to hold territory and started using his armed forces, his conventional forces and his special forces as a kind of expeditionary forces. And this is working. It's not the case all across the country, but it's working. Whereas the rebels have always had a problem adapting to the nature of the fight. Yes, they did well at first when they were fighting a guerrilla war, where they were focused on a war of attrition, going after supply lines, etc. But the war has grown so quickly that now perhaps they need to fight a conventional war. Well, they don't have the armored capabilities, they don't have the supply routes, they don't have the logistics, they don't have the intelligence means, etc. to fight that one. So, and they're fragmenting in the process. So they're not really well equipped to fight that war. So I would argue that for the moment, the nature of the fighting gives Assad an edge. It doesn't mean Assad can retake all and reconquer all the areas he has lost. But in the short to medium term, he can consolidate where he needs to consolidate. Another issue, another asymmetry here is an asymmetry in local administration. In a way, all Assad has to do is to provide local order and provision, local order and security, and maintain the economy at a very low level. And he has not much to prove in a way. The population only expects order at this point, whereas the rebels have everything to prove. When they conquer or they liberate a region, whatever word you want to use, they are expected to provide services, to provide governance, to provide a framework, justice, etc. Except they don't have the resources to do so. They don't have the organization. So they come up with ad hoc systems, and very often they embrace Sharia courts, Sharia law, Islamic law. Because that's that's the immediately available one, because this is how you deploy the clerics you have, etc. On top of this, Assad, because he still controls, the airspace, and because he still has missiles, and because he has chemical weapons, he's still able to terrorize liberated areas, keeping civilians on edge and creating an edge between rebels and civilians who blame the rebels' presence for attracting Assad attacks, etc. So it's proving very difficult for the rebels to competently administer the regions they're in. In some places it's working, but in most it's not, because there are also dire lack of resources. The humanitarian story in Syria is horrendous. It is actually the largest humanitarian crisis in the Middle East. We can get to numbers, but we're talking a lot about strategy and politics here. The humanitarian story is worth keeping in mind. Another asymmetry, and here I move to the regional picture, is one in non-state actor support. Basically, a number of foreign jihadis, Sunni jihadis, are joining the rebels to fight against Assad. They come from different places, and what they bring often is zeal and muscle. What they don't necessarily bring with them is skills, discipline. Their very nature, they care less about local Syrian constituencies than broadcasting their victories and their acts of bravado to other audiences abroad. Their thinking is not in line necessarily with the rebels. They're very difficult to integrate in the rebels' military strategy, first because the rebels don't necessarily have a military strategy, but also because their thinking is elsewhere. Jihadis fight for different cause, and there is a downside to integrating them in your military strategy in terms of your political strategy. Integrating jihadis will make it much more difficult for the rebels to get Western and Arab support because of this fear of a rise of jihadism in Syria that was spread across the region. It is important to note that the number of jihadis involved in Syria today dwarfs the number of jihadis who have operated in Iraq during the 10 years of conflict there. While on the other side, Assad can count on the support of the most formidable militia in the Arab world, Hezbollah, which brings not only muscle, but expertise, discipline, and the ability to be integrated in Assad's military strategy. And we saw this most recently in the town of Qusayr, this small town southwest of Homs that is strategically located, in which Hezbollah played a key role in taking. So to put it in a very cheeky way, who do you follow in battle, a Sunni jihadi or a Shia jihadi? All things, everything being put aside, all factors, I would follow a Shia jihadi in battle. There's also an asymmetry here in terms of regional support. The Gulf states provide money and weapons. Iran provides money, weapons, skilled personnel, expertise, and strategic patience. Iran has been operating in conflict zones like that of Syria for decades. And it did pretty well in countries undergoing civil strife. Lebanon, Iraq, and Afghanistan are good examples of that. To put it in another cheeky way, who leads the fight for Iran in Syria? Qasem Soleimani, the commander of the Quds Force. Qasem Soleimani is a wily street fighter who has fought the Iran-Iraq war, trained and deployed operatives in the 90s, drove America to a stalemate in Iraq and Afghanistan in the previous decade, and now leads the fight in Syria. On the other hand, who does this kind of work for the Gulf states? Largely princes who don't really understand the rough nature of the fight, don't necessarily want to live it. The perception of that commitment from Iran versus the commitment of the Gulf states, is key to explain the alignments or the calculations of domestic constituencies. Some constituencies inside Syria think, and they're right at that level, that Iran is way more committed, understands the nature of the fight, and is willing to do what it takes. Iran has a strategic patience to get there. Now, very quickly, to end on a more international level, there are two asymmetries worth keeping in power. The first one, I would argue, is that Russia is fighting in the trenches with the Assad regime. We can debate later Russia's rationale, over its involvement in Syria, but the reality is that Russia is very involved. It could do a lot more, and I would argue that there is perhaps an opportunity here to still play a smart game with Russia. But it's certainly more involved supporting its side than the US, who I argue is pulling from behind. And finally, the last asymmetry that I want to mention is the following. Russia has more leverage over Assad than the US has and the West have over the rebels and the political opposition. It doesn't mean that Russia's leverage over Assad is decisive. It is not. I don't think Assad will ever be on the other end of a phone call by Vladimir Putin asking him to resign, and Assad will say, yes, you told me so, I'm your proxy, I'll move out. I think that Assad will fight till the end as things are. But the reality is that this differential between Russian leverage over Assad and the West and the Arab states' leverage over the rebels and the political opposition is key in understanding why diplomacy doesn't stand a chance to work in the short to medium term. This is not to say that diplomacy should not be tried. It's to say that the way diplomacy is pursued today is not likely to work. In fact, it's likely to make it harder. One can say that the U.S. was overzealous, that this was a push because there is no real strategy to support the rebels, etc. But the point is that right now I don't see the conditions for a diplomatically engineered political settlement to emerge. Now, let me end with this conclusion. If one were to extrapolate in a linear fashion from where we are today, from current trends, we may well end up with the worst of all worlds, in the sense that we will have Assad that survives in a weakened manner, but is more dependent over Hezbollah and Iran, which means no real strategic upside if you think that the big regional game is a competition between the US and its Arab allies on one hand and Iran and its own allies. And Assad would survive alongside a variety of Sunni groups from moderate to very radical that we don't know, that are totally unknown to us, whose risk profile we don't understand, and are very difficult to contain and counter. And the danger here would be so essentially we're talking about a failed state with Assad as the strongest warlord. It will be very difficult to contain those dynamics. There is a line of thinking that is spreading that what is happening in Syria is actually very good. There is a great strategic upside in the sense that you have Shia fundamentalists confronting Sunni fundamentalists. It's Hezbollah versus Al-Qaeda. It's a wet dream for a lot of people. It is not something that I hope will impact the debate too greatly, because the radicalization and the mobilization that is happening across the region is not going to be containable. And the region, at the moment where stakes are weakening, doesn't have the tools, military or others, to really pursue a strategy of containment. The current narrative is that Assad is winning, and I would caution against it. I know that the 9 asymmetries I laid down suggest that Assad is winning. That narrative is as wrong as the narrative of 6 or 9 months ago that said that the rebels were winning. The game is not military. We should not spend too much time over-interpreting the military victories or setbacks of either side. The game remains political about those constituencies that can and could shift. At one point, it's really a matter of having better strategies, of coordinating coercive approaches with diplomacy. But I would still argue that in the short to medium term, Assad has the upper hand. He has a political objective toward 2014, and the opposition is not really in shape to decisively challenge